morning and a very warm welcome to the EPC Friday update, our regular look at key developments on COVID-19 and the implications for Europe's economy, society, its global role and for EU politics in general. My name is Jackie Davis. I am a senior advisor to the EPC, and with me this week, as always, delighted to welcome Fabian Zuleeg, Chief Executive of the European Policy Centre. Also very delighted to welcome Sophie Pornschlegel, who is an EPC Senior Policy Analyst and has jumped in very much at the 11th hour because Yanis Emanuelidis, the Director of Studies, is having some technical issues this morning. He may at some point appear on our screens as if by magic and join the discussion, but Sophie agreed to join us in case that does not happen. Sophie, thank you and great to have you with me. So this is going to be a totally interactive session, as those of you who are regular watchers of the update will know. Questions from me to Fabian and Sophie, and then I hope some questions from all of you. And we're going to devote the whole of this hour to analysing Ursula von der Leyen's first State of the Union speech, and of course all of that within the context of the pandemic and the situation the EU has found itself in, the unprecedented response that has come from the EU in terms of budget and so on. We'll talk about all of that, what was in the speech, and really at the end of our session, I hope, analyse a little bit the performance of the European Commission as a whole over the first year in office. As always, the way this works, as I say, I will ask some questions and then I will come out to all of you. Your microphones are muted for now. If you wish to ask a question orally, click on the little raise hand button and I will come to you and open your mic to the extent that time allows. If you prefer to write your question, just click on the enter a question button, write it and hit enter. And can I ask you, as always, please, please, please keep your questions brief as possible so I can see at a glance what your question is and who it's for. It's very difficult while moderating an interactive discussion to read small essays. So if I could suggest Twitter length or less, that would be terrific. So let's dive in, and if we could start before we get into the substance of the speech, Fabian, in terms of the overall tone, what struck you most, and were you moved by it? Were you uplifted by it? How would you overall assess this speech?
I think firstly it has to be recognized that this was a tremendous challenge for her. Not only was it her first State of the Union, but in many ways, since she's taken office, the world around her has changed, and the pandemic has absolutely dominated policy making. The response to the pandemic has taken up pretty much all of the political bandwidth of the Commission. So I think it was a difficult speech to get right. I think she signaled very strongly that she believes that Europe not only has a major role to play, but is the key level at which we need to address the challenges which come from this. So in that sense, I think she put very clear intentions there. In the coming month, I think one of the interesting things is going to be to see in how far member states agree with those intentions, pick up those intentions, or whether she will remain isolated. I think that will be the main test for this. But in the first place, I would say this speech covered the main areas. It did put a lot of emphasis on European solutions to the problems, and it continued also on the theme of the Commission delivering on a proper response to the pandemic.
Yeah, and indeed she said this is the moment for Europe, one of her opening remarks. For you, Sophie, if this is the moment for Europe, do you think it was the right speech for this moment? Did it move you? Did it uplift you? Do you feel inspired by it?
So I was able to listen to it for the whole of the 75 minutes, so I guess that's already a good delivery in itself. And it was a very comprehensive speech, as she touched upon pretty much all policy areas that the EU is covering. The one thing I was a bit afraid of is that she used a lot of buzzwords. It was very nerdy in that sense, so I'm not sure it was understandable to a larger audience. And I'm a bit worried as well that she might have been over-promising, because it was a comprehensive speech and she raised a lot of points, whether it's the 55% reduction of carbon emissions until 2030, the digital area, the digital decade, as she says, creating a new agency on biomedical research, or even the European Bauhaus. So it was extremely promising, but I'm not sure she managed to put that in a longer term vision for Europe. And I think that was mentioned afterwards as well, when the MEPs responded, asking a little bit that lots of the promises she made actually depend also on the Council giving its approval. So I think she tried really to be forward looking and to show that Europe is important in this crisis and that they managed the crisis quite well, especially with the recovery package. But looking forward, I think she has quite a bit of hurdles in front of her.
And we'll come back to those hurdles. Just as an aside, I think many others, wondered what a European Bauhaus was. It seemed a rather strange proposal buried in the midst of a speech that was full of lofty objectives. Can anyone enlighten us before we move on? Is this a known concept in German, Fabian?
Well, I'll let Sophie answer, but yes, it is the known concept.
I mean,
what is it?
It's a bit lofty, so I'm not quite sure what she intends to do that, but I guess it's to also gets the arts involved. And she mentioned a co-creation process, which to me sounds very Berlinish, to kind of bring in civil society and architects and the arts to kind of have this, well, to show that the EU is also supporting the arts. But that's only my interpretation of it, and we'll have to see what comes out of it.
No, I was just quite intrigued. It's not a concept I think familiar to the rest of us, probably had to be German. Just one last question on the overall tone, Fabian. Her slogan at the top, the headline of her speech was "A union of vitality in a world of fragility," and a lot of talk about fragility, perhaps less about the vitality. What do you draw from the speech about what she meant when she used the word vitality?
Yeah. I think certainly the part about fragility is easier to follow, because clearly we live in a world where there's a lot of uncertainty and where there are a lot of downside risks. I think what she's referring to with vitality, but that's my interpretation, and maybe she would see it very differently, but is essentially that we finally start delivering on the things we've talked about for a very long time. Because when we actually look at the priorities which are there, of course, there are some new priorities which have come in, and in particular, the area around health has a lot more prominence, clearly necessary because of the pandemic. But when we look at the overall objectives, there's not that much change in terms of the strategic direction or where the European Union needs to go. And I think for me, vitality means we actually deliver on those things which we have promised.
Sophie? And in terms of what struck you most, as Fabian said, mostly the priorities are the same, much more emphasis on health, but otherwise huge bulk of the speech devoted to the Green Deal, devoted to the digital decade and so on. What struck you most in terms of the substance?
So I think the health part at the beginning was quite impressive. I didn't expect her to, I mean, I expected her to start with COVID-19, but to have such a big chunk on health was quite remarkable. I would say that digital and Green Deal are still the right priorities, and she put a lot of emphasis on it. I was a little more critical, well, yeah, let's on the geopolitical aspects, I think she was not as not emphasizing it as much as she could have, looking at how the emphasis was put on it at the beginning of her mandate. So that was one of the points where maybe we'll see a little bit of less of an emphasis on it. What I think was really interesting was two other quotes. So I think the speech in itself was quite good because it managed to put forward some of the very interesting sentences, such as "let's make change happen by design and not by disaster." That was one of the quotes I really liked at the beginning. Or the other one was "united in diversity and also united in adversity." So I think the speech really tried to show that we are in uncertain times, that it is very difficult, that we had a huge global pandemic, that we're not out of it, and trying to also bring a bit of hope maybe by over-promising maybe on what the EU can do.
We'll focus in a minute on what was in there, but Fabian, What about what might have been missing? Got a comment here from Joe Leyen already. The President explained the climate strategy of the EU. Many missed the corresponding industrial strategy. Was that something that struck you as well? And if it was, why do you think it was missing?
There is a reference to the industrial strategy in the speech. So in that sense, it's not missing. But I think it is interesting to see what was emphasized and how things are envisaged to be delivered. And particularly when it comes to the 55% target, for me, one of the core questions has to be, what are the policies which are going to deliver that? I think Europe can be rather good at setting certain targets, but we actually need to see what is the actual delivery mechanism. How do we come to that number by 2030? And how do we avoid what unfortunately we've often seen in the past, that we set a target which is sufficiently far away, and then we do nothing at the beginning until we come closer to that date, and then things start to become difficult. So for me, the 55% target, yes, there's a reference to using the recovery package, using the European funding, but that is not enough. What we will have to have is enormous investment, particularly by the private sector, into this transition. And I think that's where we need to see that we have an industrial strategy which can set out how we are going to create the framework conditions for that investment to happen.
So it does seem a lot of attention on that headline side, on the climate side. And yes, as you say, there is a reference to the strategy, but not much flesh, not much on the delivery. Question, is that because the Commission don't attach as much importance to it, or because they haven't fleshed out adequately yet what they intend to do? Just a thought on that, Sophie, and then I'll come to you. Do you think it is a lack of detail? Fabian, on the industrial strategy first, Sophie. A lack of detail because it isn't there, or because they're just not read? They're not focused on it enough.
I think there's a lack of focus on it, and in some ways, the reference which is there is essentially saying, well, we've done it, now we just need to update it, and then it will be appropriate. I think that is underestimating the challenge which is there, because I think what we have to recognize is that this pandemic and the economic impact of that is changing the world around us fundamentally. It is not just simply something where we can go back to business as usual. And in some parts of the speech, I was missing a bit the recognition of how big this change is going to be. We have areas, for example, when it comes to the single market and the re-establishment of the four freedoms. There's a lot of emphasis there on Schengen and on the free movement of people. What I was missing was a strong emphasis on the questions of state aid, on the questions of competition, on the way economies are now working in this period of lack of demand for many products, and the long-term consequences of that. So in that sense, I think the speech wasn't forward-looking enough, because it didn't quite recognize for me the tremendous scale and scope of the change which we're going through.
Sophie?
Yeah, maybe quickly on what was missing from the speech. And there are obviously a few aspects that were definitely missing, or why it was also concrete action was not mentioned at all. And the first one was the Conference on the Future of Europe that was mentioned once at the beginning of the speech linked to health. It was said how important it is, but it's been delayed now because of COVID-19, but also because there's no consensus on it. And we're waiting for a joint declaration, and nothing's been happening on that side. So mentioning it is good, but having an actual plan on how to make it work might be better.
Is it slowly dying, Sophie? Is your feeling about the Conference on the Future of Europe, just to pick on that it's slowly, everybody's beginning to downgrade it, downplay it, that it's going to be a damp squib in the end?
Well, I hope not. The question that are still open are the scope of it and the leadership question. And I think if there's no consensus on the leadership question, then it might go downhill. So it's still a bit early to say, but we'll see hopefully in the next weeks or months what it will bring. And it's true that the fear can be there that it might not be as ambitious as we all wish to see it. And the second thing where I also really missed concrete action was obviously rule of law. and fundamental rights. She mentioned Hong Kong and the Uyghurs. Was very easy to criticize China on that one, but really failed to mention the rule of law in Europe itself. Repeated the rule of law report that will come out at the end of the month of Didier Reinders, which is a great step forward, but really the rule of law question is an issue in Europe for many years now, and there's been nothing new on that front except emotional quotes and historical quotes and saying that we are a union of values. So it was very much for the Sunday speeches, but not so much for the concrete action.
So the sound bites, European values are not for sale. There must be no blacksiding. For you, were just sound bites. You were looking for more concrete measures behind the annual report. That tension is still there, isn't it?
I think it is there, except that the Commission, for instance, could move forward on infringement procedures, and they're not doing it. So I think they're also, well, they want to keep good relations with the Council and the Member States, of course, and it is a very sensitive issue. But still, if you repeat this in your speeches, then you need to have some concrete action to follow up. And if you don't do it, then don't mention it.
Did you want to comment on that, Fabian? I mean, this obviously was played out, this argument, through the whole battle on the recovery fund, a recovery and resilience plan. It was paid out through the MFF battle. It would seem really that on the rule of law issue, we're going nowhere in substantive terms, or is that unfair, do you think?
I think it is, of course, difficult because there are ongoing negotiations and you have to find some form of compromise because individual member states in these sensitive areas can hold up progress, and that is the last thing we need at the moment, is that we get even more delay in terms of getting the money on the ground. But I think Sophie's right. If you are going to mention it, then you also have to mention how you're going to deal with these controversies and what your aim is overall. And it didn't come out very clearly that, yes, it is easy to say we all believe in the rule of law, but how are you going to do that? And how are you going to deal with this difficult situation which we're in at the moment?
Can I just ask you, Sophie, also about migration? Because we are expecting those proposals very soon. She talked quite a lot about it, and in fairly forthright terms. She talked about we need to take a human and humane approach, and she said we simply must be able to manage the question of migration together. I want to be clear, if we step up, then I expect all member states to step up too. It's a European challenge and all of Europe must play its part. We saw this played out at the height of the migration crisis a few years ago. It has been a hugely sensitive, hugely contentious issue. Did anything she said, I mean, number one, in terms of the message she's sending to the member states, how do you interpret that and how do you think it's going to go down? Are we in a place now where we stand a better chance of resolving this issue or not? Big question, I know.
To respond to your question, I don't think so. So I think the situation in the member states is not much better. If anything, it is worse. If you look at, obviously, the Visegrad countries that have not changed their opinion, they do not want to take on migrants. It's the same with Austria, who said we're not going to follow the German approach to take a few thousand migrants from the Moria camp. And it's the same thing if you look at Stefan Löfven, the Swedish head of government, who said we saw in 2015 that we need integration policies to make it work, and it is difficult for social cohesion, so we are not going to do this. And this really shows the link between migration policy and integration policies, knowing that the EU can only do something on the migration policy side. So it's this big question also about the competences and member states being able to have the integration policies to take on these migrants. So she mentioned the new pact on migration that was delayed already because it is so difficult to find a consensus on those issues. Now it should come out on the 23rd instead of the 30th of December. And I guess we'll have to see what's in there to go forward. I think they mentioned 5 regulations and 1 political declaration in this pact. And we'll have to go to see what the negotiations are also in the council and whether you can, well, make sure that you have a solution that will come up. But I think, yeah, maybe one more point. I think what will be difficult also is the securitization aspect, to kind of bring together returns and, well, to link basically migration to returns as well, and to link it also to the EU-Africa relations and to all those member states where the migrants are coming from. So I think this kind of aspect might play an important role in the new pact.
And Fabian, I mean, she is she's trying to push that agenda on, but as Sophie points out, the political mood, if anything, has got worse since the last time the EU tried to come to agreement on this issue. So how do you see that playing out?
Yeah, I think the situation is actually very tricky, and in some ways, as Sophie has mentioned, she has promised a lot. When you actually read the comments, the implied criticism, there's almost a moral argument to say that member states need to do more. Member states need to take their responsibility. For me, the key question then is, what if they don't? What if we are in a situation in a few months down the line when things are stuck, they are not moving forward, and member states simply do not take these responsibilities? And I think what we have to continue to recognize, and this is something which I think the speech could have also recognized a bit more throughout the speech, is that we face very different challenges in different parts of the Union. When we're looking at migration, I mean, clearly there are some countries within the European Union which are at the front line of dealing with this issue, and who are in many ways are being left alone. Yes, promising some money to help them to build camps, that is not really addressing the underlying issue. The same thing is, yes, we can talk about our moral obligation to pick up refugees in the Mediterranean, but where do they go then? Who is going to take them? And this is the kind of thing where I think the conflict between member states is still rather high. And we do not see that any of the member states really are willing to make a significant step forward, make significant commitments to try to resolve it. So this is one of those areas where I think the real test is going to be not the words, not the commitment, not the moral argument, but the actual delivery. What is going to happen?
On the point that Sophie raised at the beginning about the Geopolitical Commission, that was one of the key planks of her agenda when she took office. There was a substantial section on external relations. She talked about China, she talked about Turkey, she talked about Belarus, she talked about Russia, and there was an intriguing reference when she talked about Russian behavior and said the pattern of the behavior had not changed. And she said, and no pipeline will help that. Indeed, we have a question from our audience. How significant were her stern words concerning Nord Stream 2? Overall, Fabian, do you feel, although she devoted a significant section of the speech to it, did we get a clear idea of what she means by a geopolitical commission? And to that specific point on Russia, were you particularly struck by that?
I think we still are not entirely sure what that geopolitical commission stands for. There are different aspects to that, which I think are important. One is that clearly we live in a world where what is happening within the European Union is decisively influenced by developments outside of the European Union. So in that sense, any commission, any government within the European Union has to be geopolitical, because you cannot address a number of the challenges which we face if you only look internally. I think another aspect to this geopolitical commission is the role of the European Union in that. Is this something where we need to strengthen the role of the European Union, to have a bigger role for the European Union in external relations, in security, in areas such as misinformation, etc., coming from other countries? And there, I think what the president said was rather strong. The wording she used, particularly on China and Russia and on Turkey, were quite decisive. I think the key question is, again, what does that actually mean in our day-to-day interaction with these countries? How are we going to address these difficulties, which undoubtedly are there? So that, for me, the reference to the pipeline clearly is a message to back home. It is a message to Germany that this is not helping the situation, but in many ways it is not up to the Commission to decide what is going to happen next there. So the only thing she could really do is to give a hint of what her opinion is on this, and then hope that the German political system will deliver on this. And I think this is the general problem for the Commission and for her in particular, that yes, she can try to influence, she can try to push the member states in particular directions, but in the end, it is the member states, and particularly some of the big member states, which still have their own priorities, which are still looking at particular relationships in a way which is more guided by their own national interests than by an overarching strategy at the European level.
Sophie, there was one other issue we haven't mentioned, but I was quite struck by because it appeared to come slightly out of nowhere at the end of the speech when she talked about racism and she talked about rights and she talked in particular two things. She talked about an anti-racism action plan and an anti-racism coordinator for the first time, and strengthening LGBTQI rights. Where for me this was new. This wasn't something I'd heard the Commission talking about before. Do you think this is a direct response to the Black Lives Matter movement, to what has happened over the summer, and a feeling that the Commission wasn't in this debate and needed to be? I think, by the way, they also talking about, I think, an informal survey of Commission staff, which they've always refused to do before on the grounds that you shouldn't ask people their ethnicity. But do you think this is a waking up to something that maybe they have not? How did you read that? Because did it surprise you? It surprised me.
It did surprise me, but in a positive way, I would say, in this whole speech, because I feel that there's been a wake-up moment, that it's not only in the US that we have an issue with racism, but also in Europe. And responding to the Black Lives Matter movement, in a sense, and what's been happening over the past month is smart of von der Leyen. And she also had two very concrete proposals in comparison to other policy areas by saying that there will be an action plan and an anti-racism coordinator. So of course, we'll have to see whether this will actually change something, and it's only the beginning of a process, because she's got it right saying that it's not enough to just not be racist, but we all need to be actively anti-racist. And so that change of perspective seems to be there, which is a good thing. And then we'll have to see whether the concrete actions will be kept up also in the more long term, to have a process where we see less racism, even structural racism, within the EU institutions and more generally in Europe.
I want to come soon to an overall assessment of the Commission's first year, but and also there's a comment which I'll relate to you in a minute, and if there are any other questions on the speech, please do keep them coming in. But Fabian, I want to turn to your favourite topic, Brexit. Not only the speech, but it has been a rather dramatic few days since we last had an update on the Brexit situation, with the UK's moves to override, call it what you will, breach, override, disapply, that's my favourite euphemism for breaking the law, disapply segments of the withdrawal agreement. And Ursula von der Leyen was robust, I think we could say, on this. And I was rather impressed by her tactic of quoting Margaret Thatcher on Britain doesn't break treaties back to the Brexiteers, because Margaret Thatcher, of course, an icon for them, even though she was very pro-single market and so on. So what did you make of what she said? Do you think we should read more into that than a simple statement of where we are? And more broadly, what do you think, how would you analyse the EU's response so far? What do you think they will do in response to this issue?
I think in her speech, she made it very clear that this is a red line for the European Union, which should not be crossed lightly. And I think the underlying mood music, yes, quoting Thatcher was a little bit tongue-in-cheek, of course, trying to show to the Brexiteers how inconsistent their positions are. But when you actually look at the quote from Thatcher, I mean, this is about trust. It is about whether countries keep to their word when they sign international treaties. And here, I think we need to be also very clear that what the UK has done. And I think there's a lot of debate which misses the key point that the UK has already done this. They have broken the law by their own admittance. There was no question of what they actually stated. Now we're seeing quite some legal acrobatics where some individuals are trying to justify this in some kind of way. But the reality is, and I think every individual can see that in their own life, if you insert a new condition into a contract, into a treaty, then that changes it materially. If you say, I will only do that if something else happens, that is a breach of the original agreement. And that is exactly what we have seen here. And this raises an enormous question for the possibility of having some kind of UK-EU deal by the end of the year. Not only can the European Union not conclude any deal as long as this is still on the table, but it also raises a question of longer-term trust. How can we have a relationship with a country which has already said that if something is inconvenient, we will break it? And that, I think, raises a number of questions, not only on Northern Ireland. Of course, that is something we also shouldn't lose sight of. This is a real risk of a deterioration when it comes to Northern Ireland, but in all areas of agreement.
Okay. Can I just ask
you? It really undermines the basis of having any form of agreement between the EU and the UK.
So what is your answer to the debate over, there are those who say, right, this is the point at which the EU has to say, it has already said, this we will not accept. However, is this the point where it says, right, let's get this message through to you once and for all, we're suspending negotiations until you sort this out. We cannot continue to negotiate. Or should it be what people have called the adult in the room? Sit back a bit, make those warnings, do nothing drastic, continue to negotiate because the law has not yet been passed by Parliament. And if you like, I've even heard suggestions, if Boris Johnson wants to climb down, but nevertheless use it to claim some sort of victory that will make it easier for him to make concessions for the real deal later, then the EU should be, as I say, the word being used is the adult in the room. What for you, is this a moment where it has to say to the UK and to all Brexiteers in much stronger terms, up with this we will not put, and we stop talking until you sort it? Or are you on the adult in the room side of the argument?
I think I would distinguish here between what I think is likely to happen and maybe what should happen. I think what is likely to happen is the European Union is not going to walk away from these talks. There's nothing gained in the short term because it would just open the possibility for the Brexiteers, for Boris Johnson, to say that we didn't torpedo this, it is the European Union which has stopped the process. But I think we have to recognize that we cannot have a meaningful agreement. And I think it comes back to the comment I just made. This is a situation where the UK has already broken the good faith rule in negotiation. You cannot put something like this on the table, even if you withdraw it. It has broken the good faith rule, and it has broken the trust, or at least the remaining trust, which was still there. So I think the European Union should be very strong about this, because they
not walk away.
Not go away, but to make it very clear that unless there is a full withdrawal of this and not a partial withdrawal, not something in parallel, then there just simply cannot be a deal at the end of the year. And I think in some ways these messages have come out, but I think it can be stronger. And I think for us in the European Union, we also have to recognize that this actually goes to the heart, not just of the EU-UK relationship, this goes to the heart of the whole European integration process. If we have a union where we can no longer trust the agreements we have between the member states, where we no longer can trust the treaties, where we can no longer trust the legal framework in which we operate, we do not have a union. This is
it's something. Yeah, it's something that often strikes me about the UK in these debates, where they don't understand how fundamental that rule of law is to make the EU work, to make the single market work, and they think you can politically fudge things and never mind. But and it's always struck me as a misunderstanding. But Sophie,
sorry, just in that sense, I mean, I think in that sense, and whether it was deliberately or whether it was accidentally, but in my view, they have picked pretty much the worst possible thing they could do. So even if, as some people have suggested, this is a ploy, this was not intended in the way it came out, I think if that is the case, it was a tremendous political miscalculation, because it is about the worst thing you can threaten.
And look at the US reaction as well to that. But Sophie, a thought on that if you would, and then there's a couple of questions from the audience, and then I'd like to move in our closing quarter hour to talk about the Commission as a whole. But Sophie, your thoughts on the Brexit?
Yes, quickly, maybe to put a few optimistic words on Brexit, if that's possible.
Oh, yes.
I think she was very clear, and it was the one part of the speech I probably liked the most. Also, this tongue-in-cheek quote of Margaret Thatcher. I think that was a great part of the speech, and she was extremely clear, and I think that's an extremely good political and diplomatic message to come across. And maybe it's been mentioned before, but it's a huge diplomatic achievement of the EU to have been united for so long and to not have been. So the Boris Johnson divide and conquer strategy never worked. And I think on the other side, you just mentioned Joe Biden, the US presidential candidate, where suddenly it seems that the Brexiteers are realizing that there is no special relationship as they think if they start breaking international law. So this kind of maybe the start of the realization that it was a complete illusion, that they could do trade deals with any other countries and that they don't need the EU, will start to come up. So I'm maybe a bit more optimistic than Fabian on that one.
Fabian in saying the EU has to be tough but not walk away from the talks at this point?
I agree with that. I mean, the EU has been the adult in the room over the past years as well. So, and I think we can trust Barnier to do his job as he's been doing beforehand.
Now, I probably agree with you. It's not often I break out of my moderator role. The only thing I fear is that if they do go down the line of saying, okay, we'll let Boris back down from this, but dress up the whole thing up as a victory of some sort, as he did with the withdrawal agreement itself, when he portrayed it as the EU having made great concessions, that would certainly stick in my craw, if I can use a very English expression, but we'll see what happens.
Maybe just to add one word to that, and I know we are spending far too much time on Brexit.
We always do.
Not the most important issue, but I think the key question for the European Union is not what we do now. I think what we do now is very clear. The question for me is, what do we do at the end of this month? We have now set this deadline, and if we can probably rely on anything, is that there will not be a resolution by the end of this month. That there will be some fudging, that there will be some changes, but for example, we know that we will only have the final House of Commons reading at the end of the month. It doesn't go to the House of Lords until afterwards. So the question is, how do we actually react? And given that the UK government seems to be going for a brinkmanship approach, they are going to continue to delay making any decisive move, making any final decision. So is there a point within that process where we have to say, no, you have to address that now? No, we have set you a deadline. Or are we going to just simply continue to muddle through and react to what comes from London?
And I think we will look to the EU summit at the end of the month and our discussion at the next update after that summit to try and see some answers there. Let me go out to the room. Lars Holgaard, you have your hand up. I think you're self-muted. I can't at the moment unmute your mic. If you are still there, you've had your hand up for a little while. Can you unmute yourself? If not, says you're self-muted at the moment, so I can't unmute you. I had it for a moment there. Let me try once more. No, it's gone. Lars, if you could play with your mute button, and I'll just take a question that's written from Joost van Eersel. Don't you feel the President has neglected the need for competitiveness and the indispensable support of business? In other words, wasn't the speech too governmental, too technocratic and too little underlining the responsibility of all of us as society and the private sector. Who would like to respond on that?
I'm happy to pick that up. I think, yes, that is partially what I was referring to when I was saying that it's one thing to set a strategy, it's another thing to say how is that going to be delivered. And clearly, the key way we are going to deliver the big transitions which we're talking about, and that's, I think, is very important to also mention that it's not just climate, it is also the digital transition. It is the transition which comes through the impact of COVID-19. Then we have to say, how are we going to get the private sector to actually do that? And clearly, the private sector has to remain competitive to be able to invest, to be able to make this transition. And I think in many of those areas, also on the digital side, there was actually not very much in terms of how does that play out in terms of business. So for example, if you look at the section on artificial intelligence, it talks about how we are going to set rules on artificial intelligence. It doesn't talk about how are we going to become a world leader in artificial intelligence? How are we going to make the investment in the areas where artificial intelligence is going to play a major role in the coming years and decades? So I think for me that bit was missing. I think it can still be delivered, but it does also show a certain focus in the thinking of the Commission.
Sophie, did you want to add something?
Yeah. Just to add something, I completely agree with Fabian on the fact that this part was missing. Maybe on the fact that it was too technocratic. I mentioned at the beginning the several buzzwords. I'm not sure whether it's necessary because the Commission is quite technocratic as an institution, unfortunately. But I felt it wasn't too governmental because we are in a, I mean, with the pandemic, we saw that governments are necessary, that they have to take restrictive measures, that they do have to take public health measures, and that this wasn't the public sector, the private sector taking them. So maybe she followed that line saying, well, we actually need a strong governmental response and also a strong EU response in these matters. And in that case, I thought it was pretty good. It did mention society quite a lot, I felt, especially on the individual rights and the fundamental freedoms section, and also spinning in or complementing it with a storytelling approach where she mentioned the two girls in Italy, doing so the kind of resilience aspect of our societies, and I thought that was quite well done.
This was talking about two girls playing tennis across the roofs of Italy and showing innovation, showing a creative approach to the problem of lockdown. Lars, your mic is now on, I think. So over to you, sir, if you could.
Thank you. Thank you. I agree totally with the evaluation that Fabian has given in terms of what should happen in relation to Brexit, but I'm just still concerned about a possible fudging pragmatic solution going down the road of the so-called Cox Amendment to the bill. That's one thing. So I'd like to hear your views on that. And the second thing is that the internal market bill only covers for the moment products going from Northern Ireland to GB. But later we will have a Treasury bill covering products going from GB to Northern Ireland, and that might be even more controversial. Thank you.
Thank you, Lars. Fabian.
Yes, I fully agree. I think what the European Union really has to do in the Brexit negotiations is start thinking about what the purpose of all of this is on the UK side. Why are we seeing these things being put into place now? And in my view, that is not accidental. I think what we are seeing now is an attempt to only accept a Brexit final settlement, which is in line with the objectives of, and it has to be said, that the government thinking seems to be dominated by that section of the Conservative Party, of what the European Research Group wants and what kind of image they have of the relationship between the European Union and the UK, and that cannot work. It simply is not possible for the European Union to accept that. And I think we have to make this clear at some point in time. So yes, it will be a blame game. It will be a situation where the UK will make a number of accusations about the European Union in terms of Northern Ireland, in terms of a form of neo-colonialism, etc. But the reality is we have to make these strong decisions, and we have to also recognize that doing this, being firm, actually is the best chance we have of getting some form of deal. Because only if we're being firm, only if we're saying very clearly, this is how far we can go and no further, do we put something on the table where Boris Johnson knows that there's no more fudging.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's move on from Brexit, because as you say, not the major issue we face, but nevertheless, the UK still seems to manage to attract everyone's attention and alarm on a regular basis. I want to come back and I want to pick up on what we talked about at the beginning of our discussion on the speech. We were talking about the promises that it contains. Are member states ready to deliver? She made several appeals in different ways for them to step up, as I mentioned, she said, on migration and so on. You talked about trying to influence, Fabian, you talked about influencing member states and pushing them, but in the end. So I wanted to come to your assessment now, 1 year into this Commission, of the Commission's performance and now how we read the balance of power between the Commission, Council, Parliament. Is the Commission playing that central role that it needs to play, or is it too much still at the mercy of the Council? How do you read Ursula von der Leyen and her team's first year? Fabian? You seem to have frozen for a moment, Fabian, so I'm going to...
I think going back to the comment... Sorry. Okay, I hope I'm back.
You're back a little
going back to the comments I was... Going back to the comments I made at the beginning, we live in extraordinary times. And I think we need to also recognize that the speech she was giving, the performance of the Commission over the last year or so, has to be seen within that context of a rapidly changing world, unfortunately, in many ways a rapidly deteriorating position, which had to be addressed. And I think the performance of the Commission, while of course not always being perfect, but I think what we've seen particularly in the latter part of the spring, the summer, with the movement on the recovery plan, with the MFF agreement, is a Commission which has really delivered some crucial elements of the response which the European Union has to give to this pandemic and the long-term implications of that. There's a lot more to do. There are the longer-term trends which we should keep in mind. But again, they are there. The Commission is still committed to these transitions, to making sure that we move in the right direction. As I said before, the key thing is not the vision, it's not setting these goals, it is now how do you deliver these? And this is where the real challenge comes in, because many of the things we're doing now are unprecedented. The European Union has never done them in this way. And in that sense, we will need to see whether the member states are on board. And in particular, when it comes to breaking new ground, you will have to have the member states on board. It is not something the Commission can do alone or with the Parliament. It has to be carried by the member states as well.
Okay. Sophie, your assessment of the Commission overall and that balance of power and the degree to which this speech will be translated into action.
As I mentioned at the beginning, I think she might be over-promising a little bit, and let's hope she won't under-deliver. It's always better to do it the other way around, maybe. I think if you look at the past year, obviously it's been a huge crisis year that we hadn't seen since 2015, I would say, or 16 with Brexit. So they've managed to adapt in certain areas, especially the economy with Next Generation EU, and MFF, but there I would also say it's very much on the short term still and not so much on the long term, because if you look at the MFF, I'm not sure what is called the future-oriented policy areas got enough funding, and also, for instance, civil society didn't get enough money. So I'm not sure whether this will be some kind of crisis management and preparedness that will work also in the long term beyond the next 4 years, where we see Next Generation EU be there as a recovery package. Also, the same thing goes with Schengen and the lack of coordination that you could see. And I would completely agree with Fabian to say that it very much depends on the member states. And there one can be a bit more pessimistic because the council is fragmented. We have very different member states and very different governments. On a positive note, we saw the French-German alliance being a little bit more rekindled, with Germany shifting its position. So that's a positive. And in the parliament, we also see that it's fragmented, and we do have a few MEPs that are doing amazing work, but there as well, we have to see what kind of strategic position the parliament takes. And as we've seen during the crisis, they were badly affected by it because debates are more difficult to carry out digitally, which means that it was very difficult for that institution to keep its position, I would say.
But that comment that Guy Verhofstadt made to the president saying, you shouldn't be making this speech to us, you should be making it to the council, because that's where all these things are getting held up. In terms of that relationship between the Commission and Council, and between Ursula von der Leyen and Charles Michel, is it working? And do you think the Commission has the authority it needs? You were indicating, Fabian, that the July summit was a big success for the Commission. Would you expect now that to be built on? Do you think it has really bolstered her power and authority in order to move forward? A thought from either of you on that? Sophie?
Yeah, I think the comment Verhofstadt made was also tongue-in-cheek, but very true in that sense, because it's true that if you look at migration especially, it comes down to the council agreeing on it, and as many other areas where you have unanimity, and that goes back to the question of institutional reforms, and we see there that we're not moving forward. The conference was mentioned once, and it's not even a process to change the treaties. So we have still this huge stagnation issue, and I'm not sure we're going to get out of it. So I think the Commission will have to deal with it by trying to find small agreements and incremental reforms as much as they can. When it comes to the relationship between Charles Michel and Ursula von der Leyen, I think it's been pretty good. Communication-wise, they've been pretty good, especially after the summer marathon negotiations. They really showed how they work together. So I think that was one of the biggest achievements they made this year.
Fabian, quick one on that before we try and draw some conclusions.
No, I agree with Sophie. I think we will see what the reaction is from the council, also in the summits now, and whether there is the unanimous enthusiasm for some of these. We have already heard that some countries are quite skeptical about elements of this, migration clearly, but also on climate change. There are a number of voices. So we will need to see whether the Commission, together with the member states, can actually deliver on these priorities. Of course, that doesn't distract from having to implement what has already been agreed, and we need to make the progress. The longer it takes to get the MFF and the recovery plan off the ground, the harder it will be. So I think there's an enormous task which the Commission has to face.
Thank you. And just by way of conclusion, we've talked a lot about what the Commission says its priorities are. I wanted to ask each of you personally, if you had to identify what the Commission's overarching ambition for the next 12 months would be, what would it be for you? And if you can, I mentioned at the beginning the slogan that went with this speech, a union of vitality in a world of fragility. Maybe too much to ask, but if you wanted to come up with a slogan for next year's speech linked to that ambition that you have for the EU, what might your slogan be? It's a challenge you can not take up if you don't want to. But Sophie, most important ambition that the Commission should have for the coming year?
I mean, I think the ambitions she set at the beginning of her mandate were pretty right. So digital and climate, and making sure that we also move forward on the economy linked to the social, that's pretty much right. And now bringing on to the health union is also the right priorities. The question is whether she will manage to actually deliver, as Fabian mentioned at the beginning. And that will be very, very difficult, and we'll see where that goes. But I think from the agenda setting point of view, she got it right. And also the question on whether then we get the funding from the MFF in the long term, because I mean, it's nice to have climate targets, but the question is, how do you actually implement them, and how to make sure you have the Just Transition Fund that goes with it? So yeah, the devil is in details, as we always say. And my slogan would be, I mean, because she said united in adversity, I would say united in uncertainty, because I feel that with the pandemic not going away, we might face more fragmentation from the member states in the region, regional imbalances coming up. So this, and facing this uncertainty together and staying united, might be what will be the big topic of next year.
Thank you very much, and thank you for taking up my challenge. Fabian.
I think clearly Europe must deal with the enormous transitions which we are facing. Those are the transitions which we know about: digital, sustainability, but also the global changing world, that the multilateral system, the global level playing field are under threat, as they haven't been for a long time. The level of uncertainty which is there is enormous. We also have to face with the enormous transition which COVID-19 and the long-term impact of this crisis will have. That, I think, is a major new transition, and it adds to the other transitions. It aggravates some of the developments we're seeing elsewhere. So coming up with a slogan is extremely difficult. So I'm glad I'm not a speechwriter. I was experimenting with a few different ones. I thought Europe United, but then I was almost tempted to put a question mark behind it. So it
or it sounds like a football team.
Slogan. Europe first, but that of course has certain connotations which are not necessarily helpful. I think one thing which was actually missing from the speech in large parts is Europe where nobody's left behind, because I think we are going to see enormous differences between different parts of Europe, which will be a big challenge. But in the end, maybe turning crisis into opportunity, I think, would be what I would hope we can do. But it is a tremendous challenge because we are facing a situation where the world today already is completely different than the world we faced before the COVID-19 pandemic, and the world tomorrow will be even more different. And I think dealing with that level of change, with that level of uncertainty, is an enormous challenge for all institutions, not just the European Union, but at the national level, internationally.
So on that uplifting but realistic note, turning crisis into opportunity and united in uncertainty, I want to just thank both of you very much indeed for a great discussion, and particularly Sophie. Thank you for stepping in at the 11th hour. We're really grateful to you. Thank you to all of you for watching. Thank you for your questions and comments. Just to point out before we go, next week, watch out for a commentary on an issue we've discussed at length from the President's speech, namely the new Pact on Migration and Asylum. There'll also be events, just to highlight a couple, on Wednesday on the impact of COVID-19 on privacy and data protection in the EU. Also on Wednesday, yes, no deal Brexit. Hard choices ahead. Are we heading for a no deal Brexit? On Thursday, Cohesion Policy 2021 to 2027, what's new? And on Friday, going back to the Geopolitical Commission, but this time looking at NATO. NATO and Turkey, is the security partnership still working? And as I mentioned earlier, I'll be back with Fabian, and hopefully Yanis will be with us again on Monday, September the 28th, when we will analyse the outcome of the Special European Council that's being held on the 24th, 25th. It's going to be discussing a lot of the issues we've been talking about. It's supposed to discuss the single market, industrial policy, the digital transformation, all those external relation challenges, and now, yes, Brexit again. So we'll be back to analyse all of that. But in the meantime, thank you all very much. Have a very good weekend and stay safe.
Thank you. Bye.